In this video, we're going to talk about building the core team at your startup from $0 in revenue to $10 million in revenue based on my learnings from doing that over the past few years, and how to do it without needing special connections, a deep network, or having gone to a top college. Because when I started on this journey, I had none of those things. I was a 17-year-old high school dropout that knew absolutely nobody in the tech industry. So I made tons of mistakes, and I probably could have saved years of time and huge amounts of pain if I saw the advice in this video in time. Fast forward a few years, we've reached over $10 million in annualized revenue, largely because of the great team of 80 people globally now who I'm inspired to work with. So here are my top 9 learnings from team building from this journey. Starting with part 1, the mindset behind building great teams. The first key I learned on team building comes from Vinod Khosla, the founder of Sun Microsystems and a legendary investor behind dozens of billion-dollar companies. It completely changed my life when I saw this video of him saying that startups do not become the plan that they make, like most people believe, they actually become the team that they recruit. Because at the time, I was so focused on my plan and my execution of that plan. And I thought that the way to build a team was to just find people with the right skills to slot right into my plan and to execute that plan really well myself. I thought of myself kind of like Iron Man in the early days, building my magical suit of skills and then hiring helpers to help me improve my suit of skills and doing everything myself to try and advance our mission. That's where my focus was, developing my own superpowers to do everything and make every decision myself, from sales to engineering to design to HR, and then hiring a bunch of helpers with the right skills to slot into my grand plan. But ever since hearing that advice, I've realized that I needed to shift to operate more like Nick Fury, who recruits the Avengers team, than like Iron Man, who is the star of the Avengers team. Because unlike Iron Man, but he instead assembles the group of people with their own superpowers in the Avengers and focuses them on the mission. That is how I view my role now. I accept that the people on my team are better than me at every functional area. I humbly admit that I don't have any superpowers myself in building a startup, and I take pride in the fact that my contribution is in assembling this team of people with their own superpowers to contribute to our mission and empowering them to make the most important decisions. Because I didn't understand this in the early days, I ended up messing it up and then wasting years and having to redo it with a reset of the team, which I wouldn't recommend. This might sound obvious to you if you've ever worked in a great startup, but as a high school dropout with no other business experience, it wasn't obvious to me at all. I thought in the very early days that my role as founder was to create a genius plan, lead the execution, and then hire that team of helpers to help me do the execution better. My view was that if I created a plan smart enough and executed well enough on that plan myself, slotting people in with the right skills, then that would lead to a success. It's a classic trap that I often see in small business owners. And I lived that setup for years. It was years of wanting to tear my hair out with frustration because it felt like I needed to micromanage everybody and be involved in every little detail and driving everything forward myself. And I was grinding 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, yet still feeling like we weren't getting enough done. But after I had that perspective shift from Vinod Khosla, I applied a new level of intensity to our hiring and started thinking about each of our first 10 people more like partners on this journey than like employees. I got very intentional about interviewing and listening to ensure that each person was a perfect fit for the company that I wanted to build over the next decade, not just a good functional fit for the job that we needed done right now. And the first person that I hired after making this shift was life-changing. Her name was Monica. I remember feeling worried after hearing Vinod's advice that I wouldn't be able to afford people with an ownership mentality, because I assumed that people with an ownership mentality needed high pay to be attracted to opportunities. But with Monica, I learned that it was possible to get amazing founding team members even without being able to afford huge compensation packages. Because at the time when we hired her, we were still bootstrapped and I could only afford to pay her $25 an hour. She was a recent college graduate, she didn't have an extraordinary background, and so I didn't quite expect to see this extraordinary quality in her. But when I heard Vinod emphasize why recruiting people with an ownership mentality on the team is so important, who think of it more like co-founders, I specifically set up my interviews to look for that mindset and that work ethic. I used the interview questions that I'm going to share later in this video to dig deep and to understand people's character and what drives them. I stopped settling for the first person that had the skill set that I needed and instead started asking myself if I could see greatness in this person's future and whether I was willing to take a bet on that future greatness. I still remember that interview with Monica from 4 years ago very well, because after confirming that she had the right skill set, I started to ask these unusual personal questions to understand her as a person. After my usual skill set questions, I thought for a moment, and then I asked her, Monica, what drives you? And I saw her pause for a few seconds and could see her thinking. Then her voice got weak and she sounded like she was about to cry. But then she smiled and she said, what drives me is making my mom proud. She sacrificed so much for me in raising us as a single mom from Vietnam, and I want to make sure that all of her sacrifice is worth it. And I knew then that I had to work with Monica because I knew that she had that fire inside of her that would make her successful in the challenges that she faced. Her role at first was an operations generalist, helping with sales and onboarding and all of the other random tasks that came up in building a startup. But because of her mindset and work ethic, she grew into so much more than that over the years. She worked extremely hard founder hours with me, 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, and got huge amounts done, and then ended up doing a sales role, and then ended up being our first customer success person, and then leading customer success, and a million other things over the years. I still work with her closely like 4 years later and feel so grateful to have found her when I did, because having her was a superpower, not because of her skills, but because of her character. So that's the first major shift in perspective, which would have saved me years and tons of pain, optimizing more for mindset, thinking of things like an owner and a founder rather than just an employee to get a job done. My whole view on recruiting shifted after that experience. I started placing a lot more weight on who I recruited and replaced all of the mercenaries on my team with missionary team members who I viewed as partners that I'd be excited to spend years with on this journey, not just employees to do a job. And it's when everything changed in our business. Problems that I used to have to personally follow up with many times to ensure that they got done just got solved without me. I could fully trust people and treat them like my partners in this business, rather than having to constantly follow up with them to make sure they completed basic tasks, which was a nightmare before. But finding the right people wasn't enough. I knew that without having credentials from a top school and without having started a previous billion-dollar company, that I needed to earn the trust of those right people, which is why lesson number 2 was becoming the type of leader who deserves a great team. This is going to be a hot take, and I already know it's going to trigger some people to say out loud, but I think it's so necessary to say because so many of the founders that I see complaining about having bad employees or complaining about how hard it is with the disloyal talent these days needs to start looking themselves in the mirror. So my hot take is that many founders don't actually deserve a great team, because to attract people with superpowers who are willing to bet on you and spend years of their life based on that bet, you have to become the type of leader who deserves them first. The number one most important part is leading by example with extreme commitment to your company, your vision, and your mission. Because when you ask people to join your startup, what you're really saying is trust me. Trust me, this will be a good use of years of your life. Trust me, this is better than all of the other opportunities that you could work on instead. Trust me, this will be worth all of the blood, sweat, and tears that we put into it for years. And the best way to be trusted is to earn it. It has to be absolutely obvious to the people that you work with that you are committed to your company beyond reason. Looking back, I think that the reason Monica was willing to bet her career on me and years of her life, even when I couldn't afford to pay her very much, is that she saw how intense and dedicated I was in the interview process and determined to achieve our company vision. Those same founders who I hear complaining about how bad their employees are never fully committed to their company themselves. In all cases, they went to top schools and then they used those networks to raise multi-million-dollar pre-seed rounds in 2020 and 2021. And then they get that venture-backed founder status and they spend their nights and weekends partying or going to founder events or traveling around the world and doing everything except for being all in on the unglamorous work of building their startup. So much of building a startup is a grind. It's not fun to be publicly rejected rejected hundreds of times in trying to sell your product like I was, or going door to door to sell the product and being rudely kicked out of businesses when you're just trying to help, or having to spend dozens of hours recruiting somebody for a role only to find out after all of that time that they're just not interested, and you getting rejected by a candidate, or spending hundreds of hours working on a new feature only to find out that customers don't actually care as much about that feature as you thought they did when you actually put it in front of them. So what many founders do to escape this grind and this pain is they indulge in constant distractions instead. And then they complain about how bad or disloyal their employees are. And by the way, I'm not preaching on this as though I've always been such a great leader. I will be the first to admit that I was a bad leader and a bad manager when I was first starting out. There was a reason that my team wasn't very good and it wasn't very effective in the early years. And it was because of me. I didn't have the knowledge. I didn't have the track record yet personally to attract a great team or to operate as a great leader. But what I did have was the determination to become that great leader that I knew that I needed to be for this business. To give you a sense of how I demonstrate this to our team every day, it starts with the extreme hours that I work. We're talking more than 12 hours a day on average, 7 days a week, with some weeks being quite a bit more than that. And the team sees that all day long. They've seen it in me for years. You can interview any of the 80 people on our team and they would tell you the same thing about Adam's work ethic and his commitment because they see it. They see me wake up super early every morning to get started, usually around 5:30 a.m. And then they see how much gets done from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. I take about 2 hours every day out to work out and meditate and eat, and the rest of my waking hours are spent on building our business. And that is obvious to the team. It is obvious because of how much gets done through that time. That time mostly gets spent in the execution of the business, plus about 10% of my time reading, taking courses, talking to mentors, and listening to podcasts so that I can continue to develop myself as a leader. Even when I've traveled to spend time with family and friends, I always carve out extra hours on that trip or wake up extra early to continue pushing our business forward and continue earning that trust with the people who bet their lives on me. And I'm proud of the example that it sets. It is absurd to me how controversial people find this idea. In sports, everybody admires how hard Michael Jordan had to work to be the very best in the world. And everybody admires how Kobe Bryant worked to achieve his greatness athletically. Yet in business, when people hear of founders working super hard, they say, oh, that's toxic, or oh, that's unsustainable, and they shame them for it. I know it sounds unhealthy and crazy to most people, but being a founder with huge goals isn't for everybody. It is extremely hard to build a multi-billion-dollar business. And by asking people to join my team, I'm asking them to bet years of their lives on me. I take that super seriously. The only way that I can feel confident in asking people to make that bet on me is knowing that I work my hardest every day to be the very best at what I do and to push our business forward. Which, by the way, I acknowledge that even with that work ethic, that I'm still not the perfect leader to attract the type of talent for our business to reach, say, $100 million in revenue or $1 billion in revenue. I still have a long way to go, but I'm committed with every fiber in my being to becoming that leader. It is that commitment that I believe leads to earning the trust of top talent. To be clear, I don't expect others on our team to show up with that exact same level of intensity of me as a founder, but I do see that they feel inspired by the example that I set on that front and by the utter determination and dedication that I show up with in building our business. Because the truth is that tech startups are the Olympics of the business world, and building a generational business from scratch is arguably even harder and more competitive than getting gold in the Olympics, in my opinion. It requires endurance over many years. I believe that to become the leader of a world-class team and world-class business, it requires a world-class work ethic. Just like we take for granted, it requires a world-class work ethic to win an Olympic gold medal. But leading by example with work ethic isn't enough. The second part of attracting an amazing world-class team is having a vision that is so big that even extremely ambitious people can fit their own visions inside of it. Because the very best people have tons of great opportunities that are competing for their time. And to stand out, even among those great opportunities, the opportunity of joining your company has to stand out as the very best. Otherwise, why why should they join your startup over those other great opportunities? That's where this concept of vision is so powerful. The best startups are a conspiracy to change the world in a really big and meaningful way. And the founder vision is the picture that helps people imagine what it looks like on the other side of that change. So that vision needs to be so big and so exciting that even ambitious people see it as the best vehicle to achieve their ambitions. It's how we've been able to attract so many founders into our team. Many of our team went through Y Combinator in the past or raised millions of dollars in venture capital and then choose to join us in building this startup rather than the other opportunity of starting their own startups, which they know they could easily otherwise do, because the vision of what we're building has become large enough that it fits their vision of what they want out of their life into it. To simplify this concept of vision, you can think of it like painting a clear picture of your business in the future, where it is successful, the impact it makes, and how the world looks better on the other side. At Owner, we have this vision of building the platform that tens of millions of local business owners worldwide use to succeed online, of giving them the right tools to survive and to thrive even in this increasingly difficult digital world that is otherwise destroying their businesses. That vision was inspired by this experience I had in building the first version of our product for my mom and seeing it completely change her life. But I can say it with such determination because it is something that I feel to my core as a person. By the way, when we recruit leaders to our team, this is also something that I've learned to look for in them. The best executive leaders have a big vision of what their department looks like over the next few years in context of the bigger vision of the company. And that clarity of vision in each department is key for attracting the top talent to work for them. So that actually brings us to the third part of attracting and closing the best talent from a mindset standpoint. That third part is to become the ultimate embodiment of your values. First, you might be wondering, Adam, what exactly are values? I know I was, because for years, I thought this concept of values in hiring was ridiculous. Because when I heard of company values, I thought of phrases like have integrity and work hard. And I thought it was silly because of course you wanted people with integrity and who work hard. How is it valuable to say that you value those things? Doesn't everybody value those things? It felt obvious to me. That's where most people get values wrong though, my old self included. What I learned is that useful values aren't the obvious good traits that everybody knows to look for. That's lesson number 3. Values done right are the non-obvious traits that you would pass on an otherwise perfect candidate for not having. They're critical to be aware of so that you can be intentional about your culture. They're almost always an extension, by the way, of the things that you unusually see and value in yourself. For example, we really value people who are into self-education. We describe this value as scale yourself with the company, where we say that it isn't enough at Owner to just learn from experience. That instead of just learning from experience, that we have to take an active part in scaling ourselves to keep pace with the demands of our business, because it's multiplying in size every year. And as our business multiplies in size, we have to multiply in our skill set just to keep pace with our existing roles. So when we find candidates who otherwise seem great, but aren't investing in themselves, don't have the habits of reading books, listening to podcasts, and oozing that curiosity of constantly working to level themselves up, then they might be great people, but they're not a fit for our culture at Owner. We're building a culture where people are constantly learning and then sharing their favorite resources and takeaways with each other. We have an internal book club and podcast channel and constant discussions in our all hands meetings and in our stand-up meetings of lessons that people are learning across the company. And that's controversial because there are some good people who learn entirely through experience. I acknowledge that, but I also acknowledge that I don't think that it's a winning formula and love having a culture where people are constantly improving themselves and sharing their learnings, so we screen for it. That's how you know a value is really effective, when it's a trait that most companies wouldn't turn down otherwise perfect candidates for. So it's critical to be clear about what you value in others and then to epitomize those things yourself. I have to do this myself. We couldn't effectively filter for people who are committed to self-education if I wasn't extremely committed to self-education myself. When I started the company, I was reading over 100 books a year. And it was because I embody that value myself, because I'm constantly reading books and listening to podcasts and taking courses, that I've been able to create an environment where we attract people who also live that value. We have a book club internally. And so now that we've covered the importance of having values and embodying those values ourselves, is there anything else important to cover before we discuss how to source, interview, and close top candidates? The tactics. Well, yes, I'm so glad you asked. There's one other massive learning on mindset that I learned from Sam Altman, co-founder and CEO of OpenAI. And it's a value that I think all of the best startups have in common, but none of the mediocre ones do. And that is valuing slope over y-intercept. When established businesses recruit, they value relevant experience over everything else. But in startups, given how much is constantly changing, experience isn't the most important thing for team members, especially not in the early days. It is way more important to have people who have a high slope, meaning a high rate of learning, than it is to have people that have a high y-intercept, which is existing experience. I think of slope as something like intelligence times drive, where intelligence is somebody's innate rate of learning and drive is the intensity of their work ethic. When those factors multiply, they end up determining how quickly somebody's able to learn. So then you're probably wondering, okay, Adam, how do I suss out a high slope? There's a few different ways. The first is doing what Elon Musk calls looking for evidence of extraordinary ability, which means listening for amazing things that they've accomplished through their own initiative and their own resourcefulness. These are typically things outside of tracked accomplishments. It's not top school performance, which doesn't require much initiative or resourcefulness, but it's instead people who have started their own businesses in the past, who have accomplished great things against the odds, like escaping generational poverty through their resourcefulness. Beyond looking for that evidence of extraordinary ability, I also often ask questions that are looking for evidence of drive. So my favorite 3 questions for assessing drive are: 1, what does your typical day look like? Where I listen for evidence of extreme discipline, like having a very clear regimen for productivity or fitness or the other things that matter most to them. If they're intentional about the way they spend their time, that is often a great sign of drive and its correlated cousin, discipline. Another great question I love is what resources have been most formative to you as a person, where I listen for them to look and sound almost overwhelmed because they've had such a learning mentality in their life that they have too many resources that come to mind and that have shaped them to even list. If somebody asked me this question, I would feel extremely overwhelmed in trying to even answer it because I've literally had hundreds of books and podcasts and courses shape my thinking. By the way, if you're interested in learning what those resources are that have shaped my thinking, I plan on posting videos on this channel where I share them and I share my biggest takeaways and the specific ways that they've helped me build our business. So if that's interesting, then click that subscribe button down below to make sure that you don't miss those videos when I post them. Anyway, another great question for assessing drive, as you heard me ask Monica, is what drives you? In my experience, driven people tend to have an idea of what drives them. And it's usually either something they were born with, which there are some people who were just born extremely driven, and it's just who they are on a biological level, or they have some formative experience which triggers that drive. In rare cases, it's both, and that can be extremely powerful. But regardless of the source of the drive, the most driven people tend to have a very clear answer and intensity to answering that question, because they've been introspective enough to reflect on why they are so productive and driven and come up with a solid answer that they tell themselves. Another major pro tip, which took me years to learn, is to pause silently when the other person shares their answer to a deep question like what drives you, because they reflect in that pause, and the discomfort of it makes them add more context than they otherwise would, and it becomes more vulnerable and more revealing than their initial surface level answer. One more pro tip on interviewing mindset. A lot of the answers that I'm looking for are actually in the questions that a candidate asks me. Their questions, I've noticed, have a ton of signal in them. So I always ask near the top of the interview, any questions for me? Their questions can either signal initiative and curiosity, or they can signal laziness. Like when they ask me some version of what the company does when they could have figured it out by Googling around for 30 seconds. That earns them an instant disqualification. Whereas when they ask a thoughtful, deep question that is clearly with the intention of deeply understanding our business, it is something that deeply impresses me. So now that we've covered part 1 of this video around recruiting mindset, that brings us to part 2 of this video, recruiting tactics. Starting by answering the question of how we actually find talent and then how we convince them to want to interview you with us. There's two different strategies which can work really well here for finding talent. The first is recruiting people who you already know are great from your network. And the second is recruiting people using the gene pool engineering strategy outside of your network. Let's start with recruiting people from in-network and the huge advantages and non-obvious traps to doing that. The massive advantage that comes from recruiting people who you already know is that you already have that deep understanding of their character. You already know who they are as people, and that makes hiring them way less risky. You also probably already know whether they align with your target values and what their personal slope is, what their intelligence is times their drive. So they're much easier and more reliable for you to grade and bet on in that way. That is critical because the quality of your founding team and their character is going to determine the success or failure of your startup. Because the first 10 people in a company multiply. They end up either helping you attract great people or repelling great people from joining. That's learning number 5 actually, how high the stakes are of the first 10 people that you recruit. When top candidates evaluate joining a startup, they consider who the people are that are already on the team. And then they ask themselves questions like, am I going to learn from these people? Do I feel inspired by them? Are they even better than me in some ways? And your founding team's character will inform those answers. They will either be magnets for helping pull the best talent in to join you, or they'll be repellents for why they won't want to be associated with your team. If done correctly, your first 10 people are in the trenches with you. They eat and live and breathe your startup. And there's so much critical to do that it is critical to optimize for people who thrive in that chaos, who love the ambiguity, and who step up to own things when necessary. This is why the advice from so many industry legends is to wait until you start a startup, until you have a really strong co-founding team. And until then, to join a startup where you can learn a lot and develop a network and eventually go to start your own. But if you're dead set on starting a startup without a clear team in mind, the best places that I typically see people recruit their starting team from when they're going from network is the places that you tend to get to know people really well. Those are college, past companies that you've worked at, and the internet. Specifically, places on the internet where you tend to have communities bonding over shared interests, like GitHub or Reddit or Twitter, now X. Being childhood friends or family friends sometimes works well for finding co-founders because you know those people extremely well, but it only works well when the friends have extremely complementary skill sets and aligned values and high slopes personally, which is super rare. Most times, the skill sets and attitudes of close family friends aren't actually complementary, so the relationship becomes very tense early on, and it fails along with the business. So that brings us to the other strategy. Outside of recruiting just from personal relationships, there's another really effective way to recruit, which is how we've recruited almost all the people in my company, because I didn't have a huge personal network to draw from. I didn't know anybody in the tech industry when I was starting. I was a high school dropout, so I didn't have anybody from college or past companies. This strategy also comes from the legendary Vinod Khosla. He calls it gene pool engineering of a company, and it's learning number 6 in this video. Vinod starts this strategy by advising founders to first think deeply about the biggest risks that they face as a business, and to then build a team around mitigating those risks. Once those risks are listed, he then prioritizes them from most important to least important. And that is the first step, figuring out what the most important risks are to de-risk. An example of an important risk to solve for at Owner would be making our business model work while serving mom and pop restaurant businesses. This is famously a hard challenge for software companies serving small businesses, but it's especially challenging in restaurants because they almost always churn at a high rate, are difficult to acquire, and have a low lifetime value. So now that we've identified a top risk, step 2 in this process is to think about all of the companies who have successfully solved for those risks in the recent past. Maybe they're in industries with similar characteristics, or maybe they're in the same industry with the same risks on a different product. In our example, recent companies who have successfully solved this risk of making the business model appealing even while serving small businesses are Shopify and Procore, who did it in construction. They created a customer experience that small businesses loved so much such that they retain well, that they're easier to acquire, that increases their lifetime value, and that decreases their CAC. Then step 3 is where things get really powerful, because that's where Vinod figures out exactly who at those companies was responsible for solving those risks. Typically, the people who did the work were not the VPs at the companies, but their directors or managers or on-the-ground people who are now looking for another high-potential startup to join to escape the bureaucracy of the now big company and to have another high-upside adventure at a startup. This is why at Owner, so much of our team comes from Shopify and Procore and DoorDash and other super successful companies with similar characteristics to ours that serve small businesses and yet do it economically effectively. A large portion of our sales team, including our sales leader, come from Shopify, having stood up their sales motions, in our leader's case, the motion of their point of sale business from inception to tens of millions of dollars in revenue. So I know that they have that experience to do it effectively, even within these constrained economics. So once we've identified top candidates, how do we get them to take an interview and then evaluate them? We'll start with getting them to take an interview with cold outreach. I think of this through this framework I call the 3 Ps: personalization, positioning, and persistence. On personalization, we need to personalize our outreach as much as possible to the candidate's background and to why it is ultimately a relevant opportunity to them specifically. I might call out how past roles they've had are relevant to this opportunity, or how I loved the post that they made on their blog and how it ties back to the opportunity in some way. The more personalized the messaging that we reach out to people, the better the response rate. Then comes the next P, the positioning. The positioning is about crafting the message to include magnets for great talent within the company. These are often positive signals about the company that you can share with that top talent to make them interested. In our outreach, for example, we share that a lot of our team has come from top companies serving small businesses like Shopify and Procore, as well as name drop the famous investors that we have. But back in the early days, before we could say any of those things as signals, we would position ourselves using our big vision to build the platform that helps local business owners survive and succeed online, and our mission by sharing customer stories of businesses that were otherwise going to go under that used our platform and their videos, and that was surprisingly effective. Then even with perfect personalization and positioning, the vast majority of candidates who aren't looking for new opportunities aren't going to reply on that first message. So that's where the 3rd P comes in, persistence. I actually built this skill in sales back when I personally sold our first few dozen customers myself, but it turns out that this skill is just as relevant in recruiting, which is another form of sales. Persistence is one of the most powerful tools we have for breaking through this extremely noisy world that faces every good candidate. It's critical because, as we talked about earlier, the best candidates have many great opportunities to choose from at any given time. So given that we live in an extremely noisy world full of competing opportunities, how do we break through that noise and get them to actually take a meeting? The answer is we have to be bold and we have to be persistent. When I find a candidate who seems like a perfect fit for the opportunity using the gene pool engineering strategy, I stop at nothing to get them engaged. I will send 15 different messages myself over the course of months to really stand out and to break through that noise. This may sound ridiculous and embarrassing, and in some ways it is embarrassing, and that's okay because it doesn't come from a place of desperation. It comes from a place of having certainty that joining our startup could be one of the best decisions that they make in their life. And that persistence works. To give you an idea of how much this has worked, more than half of the leaders on our team took me more than 5 different outreach messages before they even replied and agreed to take the meeting. I had to message our COO, Jed, 5 different times across multiple platforms with deep personalization to get him intrigued initially. Some of our top engineering talent required me cold texting them, then finding their Calendlies online literally, and randomly booking time with them, then DMing them on Instagram and emailing them a dozen different times, telling them about the opportunity. At that point, they think to themselves, this person is either crazy or about to make history with the level of determination they have, and I better find out for myself. And most people view this as embarrassing or too extreme. Myself included, it is kind of embarrassing, but extreme people get extreme results. And had we given up after they read and didn't reply to message 1 or message 2 or message 3, we never would have gotten them as part of the team. Vinod says that your job as a recruiter is to turn no's into maybes and maybes into yeses. And I love that framing because it is so true. So many of the people that have had monumental impacts on our trajectory were initially no's, but through determination and through persistence eventually became yeses, and now view that yes as as one of the best decisions that they've made, which makes me believe that it isn't just a good outcome for us to get these people, but it's also a great outcome for them. Because I've gotten to see now, years later, how people say that joining our team was one of the best decisions they've ever made. And I've seen them earn exciting compensation as their equity ownership in our business continues to appreciate in value. And I've seen them develop skill sets that they wouldn't have expected, or get to know close friends now through the team. And that makes me so proud of the blood, sweat, and tears and the grind. It makes it feel worth it. To this day, I spend dozens of hours a week on recruiting, and this is why. This is another reason why having that complete and utter dedication as a founder is so important, because it gives you that certainty to use in recruiting and to use in persistence. Because with that dedication, you know that you will do whatever it takes. You will become the person that you need to become in order to make your company succeed. And they could be a part of that too. So anyway, now that we've got the candidates to take that initial meeting through personalization, positioning, and persistence, how do we actually make sure that they're a good fit for our business needs beyond just our culture? First major thing to remember is that the resume gets them the interview, but once they're on the interview, everybody starts from scratch in earning their grading. Earlier in recruiting, I screwed this one up so hard because I was really impressed by people who went to top schools or who worked at top companies. So if I saw Stanford on their resume or Google, I instantly thought to myself, they had to be amazing, and I biased my evaluation of them as candidates because of those signals. This was a huge mistake. It turns out that even affiliation with the top institutions isn't a reliable signal for high stakes hiring. They're fine signals for getting somebody an interview and building that initial intrigue and taking the meeting, since they do come with some credibility. But from there, everybody needs to be graded with the same skepticism. So that brings us to the next critically important part of the process. Learning number 8. Creating a scorecard to use for grading people in the interview so that the scoring is standardized across candidates. I learned this one from the book Who by Jeff Smart, which to me is the best book out there on recruiting if you haven't already read it. And the basic idea of that scorecard system is that before you start any recruiting process, you list out the 3 most important outcomes that the person in the role needs to achieve to be successful, with specific numbers attached. In our case, we have a grid in a Google document that lists out the outcomes and competencies that we expect, as well as then the places to grade those outcomes and competencies and write out comments for why we believe that. In addition to listing the 3 most important outcomes for the role, we list the 5 most important competencies for them to have from a skill set standpoint in order to enable them to achieve those outcomes. For example, here's what the scorecard looks like for an account executive role at Owner. The first and most important outcome for joining as a sales rep is signing up 15 new restaurants every month. Then on the right side of that specified and quantifiable outcome, we give them a grade from F to A+, which is based on our confidence that they can achieve that outcome based on their interview. We then list out any evidence in their background or their interview that leads us to believe that they can achieve that outcome or creates a concern for why we don't think they can. Then the competencies section is where we look for things that correlate with success in that outcome. In a sales role, that would be consultative selling and deep customer empathy, where we're again grading them F to A+ based on what we hear in the interview. Those interview questions get developed around the outcomes and the competencies of what we're looking for. And we also create take-home assignments, which let candidates demonstrate their abilities on those outcomes to give ourselves more standardized evidence to use in comparing people. Also, beyond running the interview this way, the other secret in our process is references, 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 references. Reference checks are the highest signal of what a candidate is really like to work with. Nobody at Owner gets an offer without reference checks, because when done right, they are the best indication of what somebody is like to actually work with. You can only get so much signal after a few hours of interviews versus interviewing people who worked with them for months or years. I personally use the reference questions from that book Who. How do you know the candidate, first of all, to start things off casual and get context? And then the second question, what are the candidate's biggest strengths? This is an important question because it makes people compliment them before you ask them for what their weaknesses are. But you don't say the word weaknesses, which people are pretty shy about. You, instead of saying weaknesses, say, what were the candidate's biggest opportunities for improvement back then, so that they feel more at liberty to share what the weaknesses were. And then last question is, if you were to rank this candidate among all of the other people that you know in this role, where would they land? Would it be top 30%, top 50%, higher, lower? And if they say say anything other than top 10% or better, then it's a red flag, because people are so polite on this process. Even if you dig, they tend to exaggerate how good a candidate is in the spirit of being nice. This, by the way, brings me to a major lesson that I learned from Jack Altman about acting like a journalist during these reference checks and continuing to ask follow-up questions to their answer to pull on each thread, because it is surprising what comes out. And you keep pulling on each thread until you understand exactly what it looked like to work with this candidate. So people are biased to being polite and diplomatic in the reference checks. And unless you force them to be very specific and realize this, it's easy to get misled by the usual politeness. So when I hear a strength, I ask 5 follow-up questions. Tell me more about that strength. Where did it manifest? Where did you see it? Or an opportunity for improvement, same deal. I try and get every specific detail so that I, in my mind, can understand to a T what it is like to work with this person from their perspective. Speaking of references, it's important to mix both traditional references, where the candidate provides the list, and to do back channel references by reaching out to people that the candidate didn't specify, but who you can find on LinkedIn for having worked at the same companies at the same time as them. Interestingly, there's super high signal in how a candidate responds when you ask for references. If they instantly send over a list of like 10 people and they say, ask anybody I've worked with about me, people tend to absolutely rave about them. They share that list so confidently because they know people are going to say great things. But if they're hesitant to provide references and they take a few days to produce like 2 or 3 people, it can be a yellow flag that their reputation among their colleagues isn't actually that great. Interviewing can be gamed, and candidates often try to game the interview, but references can't be gamed. Just recently, we interviewed a candidate for a major role that seemed really, really strong. She seemed to have tons of experience in solving our exact set of problems from our stage to Series D, and she came from a company on our gene pool engineering list that has successfully solved the problems in the past. So we were at the place where we were about ready to make her an offer, but then I reminded myself that I vowed to always do references because of how powerful they are. So I did 3 back channel references myself, in addition to all of the front channel references that she provided. And the back channel references illustrated something very interesting. Thank goodness that I did them, because all 3 of the past colleagues that had worked with her for years had very surprising things to say. They mentioned the person that she managed, that she was checked out as a manager, that she was a poor communicator, and then one of the other leaders of the company at the time said that she was in the top 50% and refused to say her strengths, knowing that there was like something that rubbed him the wrong way about her. I couldn't quite pry exactly what that was, but something was off. And then one of her other peers described major issues in her previous execution of a key initiative, which she never brought up in the interview process. And that was another key initiative that we were looking for, that it seemed like she made a number of mistakes around. I wouldn't have found that out unless I insisted on speaking to her past colleagues, including people that she didn't provide. After hearing all of those strategies, you're probably thinking to yourself, Adam, this sounds like a lot of time and a lot of work. And yes, it is a good observation, YouTube viewer. It is a lot of time and a lot of work. That is the final lesson. Lesson number 9 of recruiting is that you must be willing to spend huge amounts of your time recruiting, because there are no shortcuts, not even for the best, most connected people in startups. The truth is that building great teams takes a ton of time to really ace. I've noticed this pattern even among the best founders, the best investors, the best operators. Many of the best startup builders and investors, like Jason Lemkin and Jack Altman and Vinod Khosla, advocate founders spending more than 20% of their time on recruiting, and in some cases are spending more than 50% of their time when a role is critical. That's over a dozen hours every week that founders need to be spending recruiting, and not just founders, but also leaders and managers of teams. If you truly believe that your success or failure comes down to the people on the team, then it makes sense. Vinod Khosla is a self-made billionaire, and you still find this so important that he famously spends over a dozen hours a week scrolling LinkedIn to source candidates and then interviewing candidates for his portfolio companies. And ever since I started shamelessly spending huge hours on recruiting, our team has gotten 10 times better, no exaggeration. To give you a sense of how seriously I take it, we haven't made a single major hire over the past year without interviewing over a dozen different candidates for that role. And we often have 3 or 4 finalists where we do references on all of them, compare them deeply, fly them out for in-person. I fly out to them in many cases to evaluate them in their environment and really get to know them as people, knowing what a massive impact they're about to have on the trajectory of the company. Some of our searches, like for our sales leader and engineering leader, took over 6 months because we interviewed over 50 mostly traditionally qualified candidates that all on paper had the skill set and the experience before making our hire. I constantly prioritize recruiting in my top 3 priorities, and I'm always working on the most important search at any given point in time. I've literally spent thousands of hours over the past year doing the unglamorous work of sourcing, persisting with candidates, flying across the country on a few hours' notice to meet with key candidates, and I have no regrets about it because it has led to developing the most important asset in our business, our people. As you'll hear from some of the crazy stories later on this channel, I go to extreme measures that most people would find crazy or embarrassing to get the best candidates, and I'm shameless about it. If you really believe that the team you build is the company you build, then recruiting outstanding people is one of the highest leverage things that you can do to build a great company. Just like with sales, it requires huge amounts of time and unglamorous work and shameless persistence and rejection and perseverance and boldness. But if you truly believe in its importance, then it is obviously worth it over the long run. Anyway, that's all for this video.